Hello and welcome to Social Church. We're delighted to be joined by our friend Bruce Gore today to help us answer today's question. Bruce has been recording lectures for over 40 years and has a thriving YouTube channel under his name Bruce Gore. It's excellent results. I really recommend that you check it out. Thank you so much for helping us out today, Bruce. Today's question: who wore the Pharisees?
Well, when we read the New Testament, we run into these characters who are called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Of course, the Pharisees are referred to far more frequently than the Sadducees, but both of them appear. They both show up as adversaries to Jesus, and of course, anyone who's read the New Testament finds that they have a somewhat prominent role to play. And it sometimes is a question, who are these people? Because in fact, when you read the Old Testament, there's not any mention of either Pharisees or Sadducees. And so it seems kind of odd that they become such a prominent part of the drama connected to Jesus, while at the same time, they don't have any particular presence that we're aware of in the Old Testament. The history of the Pharisees and the Sadducees is really very interesting. They appear in Jewish history after the writing of the last book of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi. Malachi was written under the reign of Artaxerxes around the year 400 BC, and from that point on, then we have a kind of protracted silent period in which there are no more books being written, there are no more prophets who are giving the message of God to their people. This is sometimes called the intertestamental period. It's sometimes called the Hellenistic period, but it's a period of roughly 300 or 400 years that separates the last book of the Old Testament from the first of the events that are recorded, that are reflected in the New Testament era. And that period of time, that 300 or 400 years, was a period in which a whole lot of things were happening. It was a busy time, it was an active time, but it's just one that is not covered in the biblical narrative. We do, however, have a great deal of information about it. We have the so-called apocryphal material, which is inclusive of historical documents, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and certain other documents, all of which give us a pretty good insight into what was happening during those years. It was during those years that Israel was really caught between political forces on the north and political forces on the south. Both the north and the south were governed by people who had Greek extraction, tracing back to the conquests of Alexander the Great. Israel was sort of caught in the middle between the squeeze, you might say, from the north, Syrian forces, and the squeeze from the south, Egyptian forces. In about the year 200 BC, it came about that Israel, which had been under the dominance of southern forces, Egypt, shifted and came under the dominance of northern forces. And there came to be about that time, about 200 BC and a little later, so into the 100s BC, 2nd century BC, a period of time in which there were some people in the Jewish world who were viewing the Syrian presence and Syrian influence in Israel as a relatively good thing. We might say, by modern standards, you might call them politically liberal. And then there were others who were quite resentful of the Syrian influence in Israel, and they wanted to hold to the more traditional standards of Jewish faith and religion and philosophy and practice. You might say, by modern standards, we call them more the politically conservative. So in a sense, Israel had something of the same kind of political tension that we ourselves may experience in Western political experience and so on. The liberals and the conservatives. Well, the liberals styled themselves as the righteous ones. And so they took the Hebrew word tzedek, which means righteous, and turned it into a term that would be used to describe their own movement. So the Sadducees had its roots, the name of it had its roots in that Hebrew word tzedek, which means righteous ones. But they actually, interestingly, were more the liberal types. They wanted to find an accommodation with pagan forces. They wanted to be more cordial and accepting of Greek practices. They wanted to adopt a lot of Greek philosophy and more or less incorporate it into Jewish life and practice. On the other hand, there were those called the Pharisees. This is from a Greek word, aphorizo, which means to separate. And so Pharisee had to do with those people who wanted to separate from the influences of paganism there in the culture. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, therefore, were hostile to each other. And they really, in many ways, were engaged in a rather ferocious battle with each other over the very soul of the Jewish life and practice. The Maccabean revolt that took place about 165 was led by one who was more conservative, Jewish Maccabeus. Actually, Jewish Hasmonean was his original name. And so originally, you might say it was more of a Pharisee kind of influence that gave rise to that Maccabean revolt, which was an attempt to drive out the Syrian forces. Ironically, however, over time, the same Hasmonean family began to shift. This was some generations later, maybe not generations, but maybe 3 or 4 decades later, that you begin to find that there is a shift to a more liberal direction. And so actually the Hasmonean family, the descendants of the Maccabees, became more Sadducee in their outlook. But both factions were there and present down through the years, down to the time of the birth of Christ. They had both more or less become solidified in their particular views, and in some ways both of them had in some ways lost the vision of the original inspiration behind their movements. So the Pharisees in the time of Christ tended to be rigid, hardcore conservatives, very, very nitpicking in their application of legal principle to evaluation of life. The Sadducees were much more comfortable with Roman presence. They were very much cordial to the Roman influence in Israel. Both of them, therefore, had a great deal of hostility to one another, but at the same time, oddly enough, both of them found common cause in their hostility to Christ. So it does represent something of the complex character of Jewish religion in the first century, that these two movements, both of which had been around for a couple of hundred years, find themselves in this interesting conflict with one another that at the same time finds itself in a conflict with Christ. Obviously, the Pharisees were the more dominant of these in the biblical description of them, but both of them were there. Both of them had some influence in developing the narrative that we associate with the story of Jesus of Nazareth.
Bruce, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. If you would like to have your question answered on a later episode of the Social Church Q&A, then please do get in touch. You can contact us via our website at www.wearesocialchurch.com or any of our social media channels. Thanks a lot for listening today. Bye for now.